If you live in the Boston area, you may have visited the Paul Revere house in the North End. But Hingham resident Joan Gaterna often calls the Revere house home when she plays the part of Paul Revere's second wife, Rachel. We went along with Joan one day when she drove to the North End to entertain guests from all over the world with the story of Rachel Revere.
I'm putting on a little ivory brooch and earrings. Rachel, in her later years, had some very nice things. She actually had a little diamond ring, and she had a lovely silk dress that she had her portrait done in. 18th century shoes could be very workaday, like a clog, but if you were perhaps expecting a friend for tea, you might want to put on something like this, which has this squished heel. That's the key to the look of an 18th century shoe, and the tongue. And I was lucky enough to find those online. It's called Peter Fox in California that makes shoes for film production. The hat is a basic mob cap, but I altered it a little, added the lace and put the ribbon on based on a bonnet that Rachel's wearing in a portrait of her. They wore these bonnets, some people think, because housework was a dirty affair. The fires were going all the time. Women were in the smoke of the fire. So it could help to keep your hair clean, and washing your hair was an ordeal of a sort when you have no indoor plumbing or hot water. Raw day, isn't it? Yeah. I was going to have my tea out in the courtyard, but I thought it best to have my guests come inside on this day. Hello.
That day there were visitors from Pennsylvania, Michigan, Germany, even Australia.
Well, visitors, I expect that like most people, you have come here today in hopes of having a word with my husband, Mr. Revere. But I'm sorry to tell you he is not at home. However, I am his good wife, Rachel. People always want to know, you know, about that famous midnight ride. Have you all heard about that? Mr. Revere's midnight ride. You know, many people have the impression that when Mr. Revere made that ride, he was a young man riding alone through the night. Well, he wasn't all that young, you see. He was 40 years old when he made the ride, and he was married to me, and we had 7 children. For the ride was in the spring of 1775, and I married Mr. Revere in the fall of 1773. And when I married him, he was a widower. So ladies, on my wedding day, I not only became a bride and the mistress of a household and a wife, but instant mother to 6 children. They ranged in age from not quite 3 all the way up to 15. There were 5 girls and 1 boy. And as you can imagine, I was very nervous about my new responsibilities. But just about a few weeks past our wedding date, 3 tea ships sailed into Boston Harbor. Now, I imagine that many of you know what happened to that tea in the end. The men disguised themselves as Indians, went down to the wharf, and tossed all that tea right into Boston Harbor. Now, you might not know this, but it was low tide that night. So it wasn't simply a matter of throwing the crates into the water. They landed in the mud with a thud, so the men had to get out hammers and axes and hatchets and split those chests open and scatter the tea in the mud. People today call that the Boston Tea Party, but I'd like you all to know that we never called it that. It was no party, and it was no laughing matter. Think on it. That tea belonged to important people back in England. Wealthy merchants, some even in the very king's circle, and destroying it was a crime. Now that was in December of 1773. In the early spring of 74, our punishment arrived in the form of a fleet of British ships loaded with soldiers and sailors. They marched right up on that wharf, up to the Boston Common, set up camp where folks had been grazing their cows and their goats and their geese, and here were pieces of artillery everywhere. It was a very difficult time. And the ships that brought them, they arrayed themselves across the opening to our harbor and they closed the port of Boston. So this was to be our punishment, a seaport put out of business. Now, gentlemen, I imagine many of you here are men of business. You can imagine if you were a shipbuilder or a merchant who imports your goods in a seaport. You'd be out of business. But my husband, and by the way, here's his portrait. When he was a young man, he was a goldsmith and silversmith, and here he is at his bench. But it was difficult for us because, after all, who could afford a nice silver teapot when no one was working? This closure of the port was a very difficult thing for the gentlemen. But ladies, I think we felt it even more, because the little things that a good wife needs to keep her household running were not available. Pins and needles, for example, you couldn't get one to save your soul. But I can tell you that soon enough, even if we'd had them, we would have had no use for them, because we began to run out of cloth. Now, how is a wife and mother to keep her family in good repair without needles and cloth? So when we come to the spring of 1775, and my husband is once again asked to make a ride, do you think I was worried about it? Not really. I'd been married to the man for less than 2 years. He'd ridden to New York. He'd ridden to Philadelphia. He'd ridden all the way up to New Hampshire in the face of a blizzard. And now he was being asked to ride out to the little village of Concord, about 20 miles west of Boston. Why, that's just a trot. Nothing to worry about at all. He was worried, though. I've got to show you an old map so that you can understand what he was worried about. Back in those days, Boston was a peninsula, and there was only one road in and out of the town. This is it, and it was called the Neck. There was a gate at the Neck, and it was guarded. So though he was asked to ride out of town, he couldn't simply get on a horse and ride out over that road. Instead, he arranged for some friends to row him across a little channel that connects to Charlestown. He borrowed a horse, that was his intention, and began his ride up here. So he asked a friend of his, Robert Newman, to hang some lanterns in the steeple of the Old North Church. Some of you may be familiar with this story. The lanterns were to signal the countryside which way the soldiers were going. One if by land, that is, out over the Neck and through Roxbury, or two if by sea, that is, crossing the Back Bay and taking their route out to Concord in that direction.
Joan went on to tell other stories of Paul and Rachel Revere that day. After her talk, I wanted to ask her some questions about the performance.
Okay, Rachel, so now I'd like to meet Joan Gaterna. Is she in there?
Oh, yes. She's always with me.
How long have you been doing Rachel Revere?
That's a good question. I'd say about a dozen years, maybe.
How did you get into this line of work?
I was a children's librarian and a school librarian, teaching librarian, and so storytelling was always part of my work. But one summer, I was part of a social studies team teaching group that went to Plymouth Plantation. We spent a week going behind the scenes and seeing how the artifacts for the village were made, how the costumes were recreated, what sort of research went into that, and how they trained the interpreters. If you were assigned to be John Alden, you'd get a little booklet with all that was known about John, but then you had to develop a persona out of that and out of your readings. And I just was fascinated by that. I thought, this is the ultimate storytelling. These are the most interesting stories.
To me, history was battles and dates, and as you said in your presentation, everybody knows about the ride of Paul Revere. But what was everyday life like? And I think you did a great job pointing that out.
Well, that's really part of my mission, and my main one being to shine a spotlight on what the women went through in these situations. It's my criticism of the way we were taught history, that it was a list of dates, and a list of men and kings and generals and battles. And they all had families. And sometimes it was the families that suffered the most. Lots of women, like Rachel, who had her own travails. We know a little tiny bit about that period of the siege of Boston that I talked about today, because there are a few pieces of correspondence between them during that time that survive. And the house was really, really helpful to me. I mean, they gave me access to their library, genealogical materials, historic surveys of the property. You know, when you're developing a character like this, it's not just the individual that you have to learn about, but you need to know about the greater society that they're living in and what was going on around them. The goal is not just to tell the specific story of Rachel, although I include as much as I can about what we know about her, but to give a picture of what was going on in general for many families.
Do you feel an affinity to Rachel Revere?
Yes. You know what it takes to keep a household going now. Imagine then what was involved. And you had to supervise all that, care for your children and your husband. If you happen to live in a time of crisis, your husband was likely gone.
Can I imagine she was pregnant a good bit of that time?
Most women were. If you look at birth patterns, most women had a pregnancy about every 2 years. That is another method that I love, is to take the public timeline of the, you know, we know when the evacuation was and all that. We know when the artillery was mounted on Dorchester Heights. And then you look at the personal timeline of when the children were born, and you line it up, and you see that she had a 3-day-old child when he made that ride up to. If you don't appreciate what our founders did, and our forefathers and mothers, if you don't appreciate how we got to where we are, you forget what people gave to get us here.
Here at the Revere House, we love having Joan and performers who come in and reenact Rachel and the characters that are part of the story, because it really makes the story come alive. People love being in this place and getting a feeling of what it's like. We have people who come from right here in Boston. We have people that come from the region, and we have visitors that come from all over the world. We have lots of families, though. Lots of people that include families of all ages. So grandparents and grandkids, moms and dads, all kinds of people are here.
You can get more information about Joan's appearances and about the Paul Revere House at their website at paulreverehouse.org.